Let's now create a nice effect on our page navigation where all the links fade out when we hover over one of them, except for the link that we actually hovered over. And this will teach us something really valuable, which is how to pass arguments into event handler functions. And the effect that I mean is this one. So when we hover over one of the links, you see all the others fade out like this, and that includes even the logo there on the left side. So let's do that here in our page, and let's again start by taking a look here at the HTML. So we have these links. So each of them is a nav link, and so these are the elements that we're going to be working with. So menu fade animation. But now, of course, we do not want to attach an event listener to each of these links. So we already know that we should do event delegation here instead. So let's find the common parent element of all of the links, and also including the logo there. So if we were only working with the links, it would be this element, but we also want to work with the logo here. And so let's actually use this entire navigation here as our parent container on which we will handle the event that is going to bubble up from the links. So keep in mind that all of this works because events bubble up from their target. So let's select the navigation here and store it in a variable .querySelector.nav. Okay. And actually, let me put this here at the very top because we are going to need this a bit later. And it is a good practice to have all of these at the top. And the same actually here. So why not have all of the selections right at the top? That makes it a bit easier to understand the whole file. Okay. But anyway, let's now attach an event listener to that navigation. But now we're not going to use the click event, but instead the mouse over event. Okay? And I think that previously we have already used the mouse enter event, and mouse over is actually similar to mouse enter, with the big difference that mouse enter does not bubble. Okay? But here we need the event to actually bubble so that it can even reach the navigation element, and so therefore we use mouse over. All right. So then attach the function here. And there are also kind of opposite events of mouse over and mouse enter. And we use these to basically undo what we do on the hover. So the opposite of mouse enter is mouse leave, and the opposite of this mouse over is mouse out. And so we're also going to need that one. So let's put that here right away. So mouse out. All right. And as always, if you need to know more, then you can check out the MDN documentation. Great. So we have our parent element. And now, as always, we need to match the element that we are actually looking for. And so in this case, that are these elements with the navlink class on them. And so let's simply check for that. So if e.target, as you already know, .ClassList.contains the navlink class, well, then let's do something. So you see that this time around, I'm not using the closest methods. And that's because there are simply no child elements that we could accidentally click here in this link, right? So that was the reason why we needed the closest method here in this tabs, because we had this button, but then we could also click on the span element. And so here we then needed to find the closest element, so the closest button to both of these places. Okay, but here that's not necessary. And so therefore a simple check like we have here is enough. And so now we can actually say that the clicked is then e.target. Okay, So I called it clicked before. Let's call it now actually the link. But this is similar to what we did before also. So creating a variable which contains the element that we're working with. All right. And so now, next up, we need to select the sibling elements. So basically all the other links. All right. And remember that we can do that by going to the parent and then selecting the children from there. Now, in this case, actually the parent of navLink is this navItem. And the only thing that navItem includes is always just one link. So you see that each of the link is actually inside of one navItem like this. And so now we would have to move up manually not just once, but twice. And so instead of doing that, we will again use the closest method. Okay? So again, instead of moving up manually like 1 or 2 steps, we can simply search for a parent which matches a certain query. And so that's a bit more robust, because even if we would then at some point maybe change the structure of this HTML here, then our JavaScript would keep working. All right, so let's say or link, and then find the closest parent, and let's actually search for nav again. Okay, even though that's not the closest parent, I mean, there is another parent to these links, which is this one here, but it's no problem of also choosing an even higher up parent like we are doing here. So we are now at a parent of all of the links, and so now from there we can search for the nav links again. And so these are then going to be the siblings of our initial links. And so, as we already learned before, we can use query selector on an element to search for a certain query only in that element. Okay, and we are looking for these nav links, of course. And now let's actually also select the logo, and we could select it manually also by its class name, but let's just suppose that there are many navigations on this page. And so again, to make the solution really robust, it's best to simply move up to the closest parent, in this case the navigation, and then from there we simply search for an image. All right, and so this then will work not only on this navigation, but it would work also on others. So this selector here is simply for any image which has the image tag. Okay, all right, so we have all our elements selected. Now we just need to change the opacity basically of the siblings of the selected link. So siblings dot for each, and now we actually need to do that comparison that we did before. So checking if the current element is not the link itself, because of course this sibling here, so these siblings, they will contain our initial link as well. Okay, so it needs to be different from link, and actually here we need a query selector all, right? We want all the links, not just the first occurrence. Okay, but then for all the others that are not the original link, we want to change the opacity to 0.5. And indeed, we want to do the same with the logo. So logo.style. And let's see what we have already. And you see that it works, right? Beautiful. Now, the thing is that, of course, it doesn't go back. So once we have it at 0.5, it will not automatically go back to the opacity of 1, which is the original one. You see? So when I hover this, all the others become 0.5, but as I move out, then everything remains the same. Okay? And so that's why we have this mouse out event to basically undo what we did here. So let's take all of this, paste it here, and change this to 1. All right. And so let's see what happens now. And yeah, everything goes back to 1. And so this actually works. Now, of course, it doesn't work with the logo because this entire effect only works if the target contains the navlink class, right? But that wasn't the point anyway. We just wanted this to work on any of the links. And notice that this button here is actually also a link element, and so it also works on that one. All right. So our effect here is actually working already, but this is of course very repetitive. So the code here is always the same, and so we need to make our code a little bit more dry here, of course. So let's refactor this code. And usually refactoring works by creating a new function. And so let's do that here. Of function, and we will need some arguments here, but more about that later. So what we need to do now is to compare these two pieces of code that we are trying to refactor, and then figure out what is the same and what is different. So in this case, that's pretty simple. So all that changes is that here we have the opacity 0.5, and here we have the opacity of 1. And so we can simply take this code and create an argument or a parameter for that opacity. And we can then pass that opacity into the function. All right. So of course we also need the event here. So that's going to be the first one. And then we need the opacity. And so here we simply replace that by opacity. Okay. And so like this, we refactored our code very nicely here. But now, how do we actually use this function here? So usually when we have the event handler as a separate function, all we do here is to pass in that function, and then it's going to work just like this, right? So we have done this many times throughout this course, right? But now the problem is that we actually want to pass in values into this function, right? So we need to tell this function to use the opacity of 0.5 in this case and of 1 in this case. All right. Also, we need a way of passing this event. So right now, none of this would work. So let me show that to you. So not clicking, of course, but you see it would not really work. Okay. So maybe you would think that we could do this. So like maybe passing an event here and then 0.5, which is the opacity that we want. But this, of course, is not going to work. So the first problem is that E is, of course, not defined. But the main problem really here is that addEventListener here expects a function. So we need to pass a function. But if we call the function, then all of this here will become some other value. In this case, that's undefined because we don't return anything from this function. All right. And so this is simply not going to work. So we talked about this many times, but it's always good to remember that JavaScript indeed expects here a function and not just some other regular value, which would be the result of calling the function like this. Now the solution to this problem would be to still have a callback function here, like a regular one, which JavaScript will then call for us whenever the event happens. And then in here, we could then actually call this function with the event, which is this one, and then our opacity, so 0.5. And so this works because here we are basically calling the function manually. So this will only be executed as soon as JavaScript executes this function value. And so here we are back to working because here we are back to passing in a real function. Okay, and then let's right away do the same here. Set it to 1, and now it should be working again. And it does indeed. Okay, so that is the second version of our code working, but we can actually do even better and remove these anonymous callbacks functions here all together. So this looks a little bit ugly, right? Like having just this one function, which in turn will call another function. And so, as I just said, we can do even better, and that is by using the bind method that we already studied before. So remember that the bind method creates a copy of the function that it's called on, and it will set the this keyword in this function call to whatever value that we pass into bind. Okay, so let me just do that here in practice. So handle hover and then dot bind. Okay, and I think we actually already did an example like this. So using bind in an event handler. And so let's set 0.5 here just as before. All right, and now let's do the same here. So handle hover dot bind and then 1. And so this is going to work because this is going to be also a function, because bind, remember, returns a new function. Now in this function, the this variable will now be set to this value, so to 1 here and to 0.5. And so let's check that out. So the this variable, okay. And so now you see indeed that it is either 1 or 0.5. All right. Now remember that usually the this keyword is equal to current target. So let's also check that. Okay, but current target will of course remain unaltered. So you see that it is still of course the navigation element. Okay, so by default the this keyword is the same as the current target, so the element on which the event listener is attached to. But when we then set the this keyword manually, of course it becomes whatever we set it to. And so now, just like before, we can use that this keyword and use that here. All right, because the this keyword is now our opacity. And so essentially we use the bind method here to pass an argument into a handler function. So let me just write that here. Passing an argument into handler. And I'm using quotes here because, of course, this is not really an argument. So in fact, we don't even need this here. And in fact, it is impossible to pass another argument into an event handler function. So any handler function like this one can only ever have one real argument. And so in this case, can only ever have one real parameter, and that is the event. But if we want to pass additional values into the handler function, then we need to use the this keyword like we just did here. And if we wanted multiple values, then we could, of course, pass in here like an array or an object instead of just one value. So this is kind of a workaround into the fact that the handler function can only take one argument. So it's a really nice effect, and as I said in the beginning, it also taught us how we can pass arguments essentially into handler functions.